We are now live. Hello, everybody.
Good
morning. You for bearing with us as we get the live stream set up. We are now also going to go live on Instagram. Trying to get it all set up. Let's see. Live. Oh, wait. That's not working. Can you talk to me a bit while I set this up?
Yeah, we're having Friday the 13th on Monday, apparently. But we are happy that sorry.
Wow, that was great.
I don't do this well at
all. Okay, trouble starting the live video, checking the connection. Okay, we are not online. Okay, thanks everybody for waiting as we sort of get this started. Okay, now we're online.
Coffee.
Exactly. Jenlene has kindly provided us with a cup of coffee. This is sort of like when you're in the lecture theater and you're trying to get the PowerPoint going. That's the equivalent of it.
Yes, technology problems are inescapable.
Okay, let's see if that. Yes, we are now live both on YouTube and on Instagram. Hello, everybody. This is my chance for me to check myself. Jenlene is sipping her very first coffee. We are going to be beginning the first. Well, I should say, no, let me say it differently. We are, of course, not at the beginning. We are reaching the end. We are already at week 11 of a 12-week lecture series. In other words, this is the penultimate class. And after week 12, we're going to have a sort of a summarizing class where we all weave it all together. Yeah?
Week 12 is the penultimate.
Well, 12 is the final class of teaching, and then week 13 is the class where we weave it all together. So there's multiple endings, as it were, if that makes sense.
Well, it's the anti-pre-penultimate.
Something like this. Yeah, yes. Anti-pre-penultimate. Thank you. Welcome to the anti-pre-penultimate lecture. It's actually quite warm in the car today.
Okay.
So, what are you doing?
Yeah, off the floor.
Off the floor. Okay, so if you have at any point gone back to previous lectures, remember we designed these classes so that you could go back and they would mirror each other. In other words, that we're trying to create a chiasmic structure here. And if you're curious, this lecture is going to be mirroring the second lecture that we did. The second lecture, of course, was during the forest fires, which is the one when we were filming in our study. So if you go to our IGTV, you will find that lecture because that is the lecture in which we are sitting at home rather than in the car. So that's what we're going to do. I also want to say everybody who has sent us their addresses, thank you so much. It is deeply wonderful and quite moving, actually, to know that you guys are coming from so many different parts of the world, including what to my mind are very remote parts of the world, and certainly parts of the world that I have not yet had the joy of visiting. So I feel a sense of kinship in terms of our correspondence, and I think you feel that way too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pretty much, yeah. So thank you for sending us your addresses, and we're going to be sending out those cards pretty soon so that they arrive by the end of this lecture series as a thank you, as it were. Okay, before I start, and thank you everybody who's joining us. Before I start, do you have a cup of coffee for me?
I do.
Okay, thank you very much. We pre-ordered these, so that's really wonderful. Okay, so the title of this lecture, I think those of you who are on YouTube can probably already see the title, which is sort of cheating because usually on Instagram we like to say, the title is coming later. It is Facilis Descensus Averno. Facilis Descensus Averno.
Facilis easy? Descensus?
Yeah.
I don't know. Descending?
Yeah, descending. And Averno is the name for the underworld here. These are the immortal world. Blah. These are the immortal words spoken in Virgil's Aeneid, as the protagonist is led into the underworld, as it were. And if you go back, I'm not going to say this more often, but if you go back to the second lecture in this lecture series, of course, the underworld featured heavily in that one as well. That was the one where we were descending together with Orpheus, right? Okay, so I'm going to take a big sip and I'm going to stop drinking.
Going.
I know it's a little bit cold, actually, isn't it? Yeah. We really early in advance. Okay, so I want to kind of think about where to start here. I actually took a note about where to start. I usually have like one note for where I start and one where I end. Yes, okay. I want to start I'm sorry that you're not on the Instagram, by the way.
I'm
For those of you on Instagram, exactly. Jen Lane is sitting next to me. There's this idea that runs throughout thought that, and sort of Walter Benjamin, maybe the more well-known person to make this point, is that a historian is a prophet who looks towards the past, right? It's someone who looks towards the past. You're trying to interpret the signs for the future. So any historian is a prophet who looks towards the past. And we could sort of take that into the opposite direction. And we could say that the theorist, someone like yourself or myself or our students here, engaging in theory is not to be a prophet who looks into the past, but is an archaeologist who looks into the future. In other words, we're constantly going over territory that has already been gone over. Some of us are, like myself, sad detectorists who lease someone's land in order to dig for treasure. But mostly it's that process of going over ground that has already been covered and
revisiting. Yeah.
Exactly, revisiting it and sort of scattering the dirt and trying to see things in a new light. And of course, there's a level of abstraction that occurs in that form of archaeology as well, which is you are trying to infer the meaning of something larger by means of what is really only a particular trace of it. This for a long time was the dream of archaeology and paleontology, was that you could look at one bone and sort of deduct the entire species from it, the entire animal, which of course is not technically possible, right? So there's a form of abstraction that takes place in archaeology that I think is very true to any theorist. And it's also, in a sense, the opposite of being a historian, right? Historian, Pacha Benjamin is someone who looks into who's a prophet who looks to the past, right? A historian is a prophet who looks to the past, whereas a theorist is an archaeologist who looks to the future, as it were. So keep in mind that theme of, I don't know what we would call them, like conjointness, like things that seem seemingly disjointed, but are also as of one piece. There's an analogy that Plato has that I think is quite interesting here. And the analogy has to do with an archer. So bow and arrow, right? And when you're an archer, when you use a bow and arrow, of course you sort of have that tension, right? When I was a kid, I used to get like clothes hangers and play that I was Robin Hood. And Plato says, think about it for a moment. When you're an archer, are you both pushing and pulling the arrow at the same time? And the answer is no, you can't push and pull an arrow at the same time. Both your hands are doing something else. One is drawing the string. Maybe we have some archers in this class, whereas one of you is holding the bow taut. There's opposite movement that is taking place that creates the tension itself from which the bow is launched. This seems pretty obvious, right? As it were. So I want to keep that image in mind of the bowman here, because the bowman is what we're going to try to be in this. So we're not really historians or archaeologists, but we're going to think of ourselves as bowmen, because we are, of course, launching ourselves into the next part. And that tension, that constitutive tension that takes place when you have those opposites is really important. And if you go to the very beginning of this lecture series, that's how we start with the first three, right? As we go from binaries to the opposite tension to the coincidence of opposites. Okay, no more references to previous classes. I will not do that anymore. I know that these are supposed to be standalone classes, which I think they are. Of course, the god of archers, the god of bowmen, understands this better than anyone. This is probably, I don't want this to be like a trivia.
Who's the god of bowmen?
Well, who is the...
Artemis.
Actually, not Artemis.
Really?
Because, well, the thing is, Artemis is what, like...
goddess of hunting.
Exactly, but not of bows itself.
Okay.
It's a little bit like you could be the god of warfare, but not the god of guns. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
and so actually, it's Apollo. Apollo is the
twin brother of Artemis. Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very impressive. See, that's. You want to do a diversion here?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys.
That's it.
So Apollo is actually the patron saint, as it were, of bowmen, and there's a duality in that role of course, which is that Apollo is also the god of the arts and of poetry. And there's a very specific, I think, duality here about the tension implicit in the arts and the intention and the analogy that Plato makes in the Bowman. So we sort of have that tension between opposing forces that are creating something, right? Okay, so I want to go back to the let's say the title of this lecture for a moment. Right, Facilis Descensus Averno, because we are going to slowly descend together into the darker realms of thought, as it were, and then sort of come back out. Because the hell, the underworld that Aeneas is taken to, but I think Sibyl is not actually a name, but Sibyl is a category of reclusive witch-like women. Anyway,
Maybe.
this is like beyond trivia. Yeah. When I watch Faulty Towers, I always think a little bit about Sybil. That's actually a joke about like she's slowly dragging Faulty into hell with her, which I know that seems sexist. I'm sorry. That's not my intention. So in the Aeneid, we have the central character being sort of dragged into hell. Not dragged into hell. I mean, he's led into hell. And we've seen different versions of hell as we've gone through these lectures. Before we started the series, we talked about Dante's Inferno. Then we had Orpheus and Eurydice. And what's really curious about the underworld, I shouldn't call it hell, the underworld in Virgil's Aeneid, is that it's a place of distortion. So it's actually not the bottom of society. It's not the underbelly of the world. It's not this sort of nefarious place that you go into in which people are punished for their sins. There's no sense of Christian morality in that sense. Instead, the underworld in Virgil's Aeneid is a place of distortion, is a place of distortion of time and distortion of space. In other words, it is a realm in which both the future and the past is present. This is also why you could think of the true representative of the underworld being you remember who looks both forward and backwards on the coin?
Well, it's the Janus?
Yeah, Janus. I say Janus because I was taught it wrong, but yeah, it's the Janus face, right? It's this looking. You and I could do a Janus face right here on YouTube, I think. Do you want to look that way? No? Okay.
Yeah,
Janus face. Yeah, exactly. So looking both forward and backward. And the constitutive split between looking in two directions at once. And that is what the underworld is in a sense. It's that place that it's not just warping time, but it's specifically time imploding upon itself. And so you see both the future and the past. You see it like a historian or a prophet. You're both looking forward and backward. Yeah, you're going to say?
I think that perspective, this forward and backward looking, is also a little more intuitive in Greek mythology, because there was this notion, I mean, the way that I was taught was there's this sense that the gods know everything that's going to happen, but they're sort of powerless to stop things that happen. They just need to watch the world work itself out, and if they interfere too much, that'll just invite total chaos and unpredictability and uncontrollability. And so they have to exercise restraint in order for the world to maintain harmony and balance.
It's a really interesting point you make, and one that I would be happy to develop a little bit further, because in theoretical terms, right, you're introducing the relationship within Greek mythology between necessity and contingency. In other words, necessity being a form of fate, contingency being a form of unexpected individual agency from the actors in the world. God, I feel like I'm sounding like an academic.
No,
sometimes
it's a
that
really
happens.
good way to articulate
And so what we have here is the way in which, to be Hegelian for a moment, the way in which contingency becomes retroactive necessity, and vice versa, in which necessity becomes enacted through contingency.
Right.
And the gods, in a sense, are the ultimate arbiters of that, because the gods, what the gods do is that they actually have contingency in their own necessity. And it's the humans who are fate bound. So it's the contingent actors who are driven by necessity or need. And so within Greek mythology, there's an awareness of the fact that just because something is made for something, or a person is made for something, doesn't mean that they fulfill that purpose. The analogy that Plato uses could be totally contemporary, because Plato says, not all nurses are very healthy people. In fact, many nurses are very unhealthy people. The images of the chain smoking. what tiny diversion here, if you will indulge me. Excuse me. When I was a student, I briefly lived in Strasbourg in France, and I shared an apartment with the woman who shared her home with me. This is not a sexual relationship. This is a this person rented a flat to me at a high price, and she was a nurse. So most of her day she would be working at a hospital, and I wouldn't see her. And when she was home, she was the most French person I'd ever met because she would sit on the couch and chain smoke, never eat, and watch French public television literary discussions. And that was all she did. And I thought it was very impressive. It's the first time I've actually seen someone with the nicotine fingers. Okay. So, so in the same way, for example, that not all nurses obviously are healthy, objects don't always correspond to their determination. Right. And that's sort of important to keep in mind. And there's specific objects that specifically blend the contradictory purposes. I'll give you an example. Like a spinning top.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like a spinning top. Is that how you call it? Like a spinning top? What does a spinning top do?
Spins.
Yeah. You go like this, right? Like you sort of flick it, and a spinning top will stay in place while moving.
Or like a coin, if you spin a coin.
Or if you spin a coin, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Arjana's coin.
Yes.
It stays in place while it's sort of rotating very strongly.
Yes.
And for Greek thinkers, or for in antiquity, that's sort of an uncanny image almost. Because if you think about one of the definitions of the Freudian uncanny, it's always something that moves that isn't supposed to move. But if it's not so much of a description of something that is still starts moving, or something that is moving becomes still. It's that something is both moving and still at the same time.
Oh, it makes me think of the end of Inception, of course, because the top is his sort of totem object about determining reality.
I'm really glad that you said that, because that's exactly where I was leading. I actually made a little no, that's the best, is when you and I are in sync. That's what I enjoy most. Like, that's when we have that fusion. Makes me really happy. And I feel like it inures me against accusations of sexism that we have every once in a while. There's a certain segment of people on the internet who are convinced that I have held you hostage. Is the hashtag free the lady. Anyway, diversion.
Thanks for freeing me, internet.
I'm actually the one who's like tied down to this chair. Okay, so you mentioned Inception.
Yes.
And that's exactly where I was thinking. So can you briefly expose to us, not summarize Inception, but like, what do you have in mind for those of you who haven't seen Inception?
So Inception is this notion of, if we create a world where people aren't sure about their reality, if they're experiencing is actually happening, if they're awake, or if they're dreaming, the way that you can come to grips with reality is if you have some object that behaves in a particular way, in a predictable way. And of course, the protagonist sort of wakes up from his dream and walks away from his totem object. It's not even about whether or not the top ever falls over. It's that he leaves it behind. Anyway, sorry.
No, don't apologize. I mean, that was really, you're good, right? You introduced sort of one of the key elements of the film, which is the idea of the totem object that keeps you aware of whether you're in the waking reality or the reality of the dream. And the very end of Inception, the final shot of Inception, is ambiguous as to whether or not he is living in one of the fantasy worlds or in the supposedly real world. And the final shot of the film, spoilers for Inception, I feel like there's if there's an expiration clause on spoilers. Yes. Is of course the top
shorter for blockbusters.
We've been taught that the top anyway, the final shot of the movie is the top is still spinning, and if it spins into perpetuity, then he's in the dream. But we don't know if he's in the dream. Sort of one of those ambiguous moments. And what's important here is that it's no coincidence that the totem object in this case is a spinning top, because within Greek philosophy, it is the image of the top that is itself the marker of ambiguity. In other words, it's like the Lacanian stain that cuts into the real. And so the inversion that takes place is that it's not the tension between the dream level and the real level. It's that the top itself is that world, if it were. It's like you could think of the top as like a snow globe in which he's living. Distortion of reality is the premise of reality itself. It's not that you live on a binary between one world and another. It's that distortion is inscribed within reality itself. And so the top in Inception is a really beautiful sort of metaphor for that, as it were. And of course, a meta narrative on film itself, because after that scene, you leave the cinema and everyone's discussing the movie, and you've sort of exited that fantasy realm. It's a little bit on the nose, I suppose. So we have the idea of things, objects that have contradictory purposes. Objects that are both moving and still at the same time, and the ambiguity of something fulfilling dual purposes, in a sense, dual fates, right? Dual necessities. And this isn't just true for objects, it can also be true for people. And where Plato and Lacan are like, I mean, they're not similar at all, but where they're surprisingly like where their edges meet is in terms of desire. And for Plato, desire is sort of the lowest emotion. It's the one that you have to constantly keep in check. And one of the things that Plato points out is that desire makes all of us into spinning tops, because desire is inherently contradictory. For example, think about Orpheus for a moment. Orpheus is like the spinning top. Orpheus is caught in the moment in which he desires to both look at Eurydice and condemn her thereby to eternal damnation, is what the Christians would call it, and or to not look and to lead her out of the underworld and have a life together. Right? He's caught in those contradicting desires: the desire for a life of bliss with Eurydice, and the desire to look and condemn Eurydice at once. And there's something, I think, that if you read Plato from a Lacanian perspective, Plato is actually really aware that that isn't just something that we have to get rid of, but that that's constitutive of the subject as such, is competing desires. In a sense, we're all spinning tops because we all have desires that are constantly contradictory. And so we can classify certain desires, right? Like Plato says, let's say that you're thirsty. There's a difference between being thirsty and saying you want a beer. Right? If you want a beer, you're thirsty for a beer specifically. If you go into a bar and you order a beer and someone gives you a glass of fruit juice, you're probably not going to be happy. Imagine you go into a bar and you say you want a beer, and the bartender just hears, "I'm thirsty." He'll give you anything to drink. Right? So there's a difference between saying I want a particular way of sating my desire versus my desire needs to be sated.
Have you ever had that experience where you go to drink from a cup and you think it's one thing and it's actually something totally different, and it just completely throws you off?
I don't think I've had that experience.
It's horrifying.
I will look out for it. I've had it with hot and cold. I think something is hot and then it's cold. And of course, we could do a whole thing about hot and cold because they're opposites, but at the same time, the body registers them as being the same, which is why not only can you burn yourself through cold, if you think something really cold is hot, your body will respond as if it's heat, right? So yes, it's a really interesting point. If any of our students have ever drunk something and thought it was something else, you can let us know in the comments. This is going way off the rails.
Yeah,
I really like it. I really enjoy that. That's excellent. So we have these contradictory passions, as it were, and desires within us. We think we want one thing, but we want something else. Of course, the Lacanian version is to say we don't want anything. We simply want wanting itself. We desire itself. And Plato, in his own way, is sort of leading up to that point. You know, last lecture, we talked a little bit about how every triangle is a love triangle if you love triangles, to repeat that particular joke that I stole from the internet. And that's very true for Plato as well, because Plato is constantly thinking in terms of threes. So we've talked about twos thus far, right? We've talked about the idea of motion and not moving. We've talked about binaries. We've talked about Janus, looking both into the past and into the future. The bow and the arrow. We have all these. And for Plato, it's never actually on the level of two. Everything happens on the level of three. So if you have a chance to follow these three lectures, the previous one, this one, and the next one, keep in mind that the image of three and how three becomes both 2 and 4 is really important. So what do we mean by why 3 is really important? I'll explain. Plato is, of course, very well known for the Republic. And he has lots of really interesting arguments in the Republic. And we should read the Republic less as a manual for society. But even if you read the Republic, Plato's not like, that's not his point. Like, he's not writing like 10 ways to
how-to
fix.
guide.
Yeah, it's not a how-to guide. It's a much more elegant argument. Because what Plato is saying is he's starting with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is, what comes first, society or the individual? That's not a hypothesis. I'm getting there. What comes first, society or the individual? And this is where we can see a total difference with Aristotle. Aristotle explicitly says the city comes first, society comes first, and then comes the human individual. The human individual is a particular derivative from the universal condition of society. Plato is much more sophisticated. This is where I'm coming into the you could really describe philosophy as a rift between Team Plato and Team Aristotle, or Team Socrates and Team Aristotle. And if you look at the diaries of Simone Weil, this is like one of those pretentious things. If you look at the diaries, if you happen to have a moment to read the diaries of Simone Weil when she's quite young, she writes about that discovery. And what's interesting is that Simone Weil writes about how much she dislikes Aristotle in a very like team one vampire versus team something, right? So there's definitely that. And here we can actually see one of those differences between Aristotle and Plato, because on a starting foundational level, Aristotle posits that the city comes first and then comes the individual. And Plato is much more sophisticated than that, because he wants to undermine that duality. And he says, let's take for a minute the hypothesis. See, I came to the hypothesis. The hypothesis that the city is structured like an individual, and that the individual is structured like a city. Let's take for a moment the idea that they function similarly, that if we were to pop the hood, to use a very American metaphor, but make it sound British. Hello, chap, if you pop the hood. Okay.
Wouldn't it be bonnet?
Bonnet? Yeah, the bonnet. Yeah. So anyway, I only got my driver's license a year ago. That if we stripped the gears of society, we would find a similar, to use a very expensive term, libidinal economy as the individual, that they function according to the same principles, and that the principles that they function according to are threefold, that there are three competing elements within society that are mirrored within the individual. That's his hypothesis. Yeah.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me what they were.
Oh, no. That would be so mean.
Guardians.
Oh, what? Yeah, guardians, yes.
I think that's all I remember.
Okay, so
Philosopher King.
No, not Philosopher King. So that's like my Instagram profile.
Diary of Simone Weil.
Simone of Weill. Okay, so the three tiers. Jenilyn was correct to say that it's three tiers, and that the top tier is in a sense the guardian, who he also likens to a shepherd. And then the middle one is an auxiliary class, those that facilitate the guardians, which he refers to as the dogs of the shepherds. In other words, bureaucrats, essentially. And then finally, we have the plebs, we have the workers, we have the masses, who for Plato are the lowest in this tier, who are ruled by irrational urges. I don't know, like urinating in public against temples, and that these have to be ruled by the two other classes. But I want to introduce a very big but here, which is, for Plato, it's usually read that these are like a hierarchy, and it's easy to read Plato that way. But I'm going to try to make the argument that it's much more sophisticated than just saying that it's a hierarchy. It's actually a much more dialectic structure, because if it weren't, then he'd be surprisingly similar to Aristotle. So we've got these three classes within a society. We've got the guardian class, which in a sense is the ruling class. We have the auxiliary class, which is the facilitators, the bureaucrats. And then we have the working class. Of course, this is pre-Marx, obviously, the sort of the masses, the general id of society as such. of course, there would be no society without each of those constituent elements. I mean, you can't just have a ruling class with like
no subjects.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the comedy. What's so funny about Monty Python and the Holy Grail is that the king sort of has to confront his citizens, and his citizens don't really recognize him. That's the immortal scene in. You know this one, right?
Yes.
It's the what does the peasant say to the king?
What is it? You've been handed a sword by a lady in a strange lake. That's no way to run a government, form a government.
That's actually very good. Yeah, exactly. And you know,
but there's another one.
Plato would agree. And it's also the peasant who says there's a king, and his wife says, "How do you know he's a king?" And he says, "Well, he's not covered in shit." That's sort of Plato's universe here, right? Is what distinguishes the guardian from the plebs while he's not covered in shit, basically. So those three parts are for Plato mirrored within the individual, within your libidinal economy. This is my favorite expensive psychoanalytic word. Anybody who says libidinal too often, you have to be really suspicious of that person.
Get it out of your system now.
Yeah, I'm going to say one more time because I know nothing about economics. Libidinal economy. And okay, so within the individual, within these subjects, right? We have similar three features. Instead of the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the workers, the masses, we have reason, which is the highest order. We have passion, which is useful but suspicious. For example, useful in fighting battles, suspicious when you, once your opponent is dead, you keep hitting him in the head even though he's already dead, right? You can get carried away. And then we have desire as being the lowest form of interaction. And for Plato, roughly these three correspond. So the guardians are the rational class, the auxiliaries are the necessary evil, the passionate class, those who fight wars for you, those who are willing to risk their life and healthcare for you. And then there's the underclass of the desirous masses, essentially. And of course, it's a very patrician, very elitist way of looking at the world. But my argument here is that while Plato may be elite, he is not necessarily elitist. And I'm going to try to unwrap that for you. It's also why I said this was the politics class, ultimately. So that is the hypothesis that Plato has. It's not that the city comes first and that the individual comes first. It's actually that they are made up of three constituent elements and that they mirror each other. And so why is Plato even playing this game, right? There's a lot of sort of rhetorical games going on. And the reason is because he has an overarching argument. There's always an ulterior goal or motive for Plato, which is he's interested in the idea of harmony, and specifically a form of harmony which he calls morality. Because he's looking into the question, what is moral? What is good? What is the definition of morality? How do you come up with the definition of morality? And how do you create a good society? How do you create a moral society? And the argument that Plato makes is that in order to have a moral society, a good society, you have to have the individual and society being exactly in sync. And the definition that Plato comes up with can either be determined as extremely oppressive or as sort of proto-communist. Because Plato says when everybody is doing their job, that's when society will be in harmony, when everybody does their assigned role. But wait a minute. This is kind of a creepy thing to say because
how do you know what your assigned role is?
Yeah, how do you know what you're like? I mean, it's all good and well for you and me to say that our assigned role in life is to drink coffee and hold classes in a car. But what about the person who, has to do something undesirable? What about those people in our society who are relegated to doing work that is considered sort of a lower caste almost, right? Cleaning toilets, etc. No one is born to scrub toilets. So you look at Plato and you think, wow, there's an extremely problematic argument being made here about everybody should know their place. And some people are born into high positions, other people are born into low positions, and you should just be happy with that. But even Plato knows that that sounds really bad when he says it. And so he's quite elaborate in working out that point. So again, harmony, right? The idea is that when everybody is doing their job, that's when society works. Now, Plato immediately says this is only part of my overall analogy, because if society is structured like an individual and the individual is structured like society, then it means that doing your job means that on a sub-level, all the three parts of you are doing their job. In other words, when the three constituent elements, let's say in your head, are doing their job, that's when you can do your job within society. In other words, we don't just have the individual working for society. We have a society in which the individual comes into full fruition.
Okay.
And here we end up with like the proto-communist idea, which is that a moral society is a society in which the condition of the thriving of society becomes the condition of the thriving of everybody else. And those three parts of you, again, are of course reason, passion, and desire. But Plato is not giving you 10 tips for life because it is a more sophisticated argument. Reason, passion, and desire are not standalone poles. They don't exist in a vacuum. They're triggered, they're activated through their intervention in the other. So I'm going to see if we can come up with some examples. Reason is the controlling of passion, as it were. Passion is useful, but passion, if it's not checked, becomes destructive. Passion is already the utilization of desire. In other words, I'm acting passionately to enact my desire. But passion is also the contradiction of desire. For example, I'm really hungry, but I'm going to keep working on my project because I want to finish my project. At this point, passion is contradicting desire because there is an overarching desire, the desire to finish a project. That desire, in turn, is regulated by reason, which is between the competing desires of wanting to go and get food and the competing desire of finishing a project, I would rather finish the project. And so what happens is that each of the three are not only dependent on each other, but they're actually activated at the exact moment which they are sort of deactivated.
Well, you're saying that none of them really exist in a vacuum. They only come to the surface when they're sort of motivated by one of the other elements. Okay.
That's really, really nicely way to summarize it. Thank you. They don't exist in a vacuum. There is no such thing as reason alone. There's no such thing as passion alone. There's no such thing as desire by itself. They're all derivatives of the coincident of opposites between the others. They're all emerging as the arrow that is being shot out of the tense bow. Between desire and passion, we have the energy of reason. Between the reason and passion, we have the energy of desire. Between reason and desire, we have the energy of passion. We are once
Yeah, no, it makes me think, I mean, so visually of like a color chart, like a color wheel where you have the three primary colors, and whenever they overlap, they're making a new color. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's actually a much more intuitive image than I had in mind. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's really, really good. Because the whole point here is that none of them exists without the other. So it's a miniature analogy for his overall hypothesis, which is there is no such thing as society without the individual, and there's no such thing as the individual without society, and vice versa. The individual doesn't exist without those three elements, which in turn are mirrored through society, etc. In other words, Plato creates a system that is uniquely imploding and exploding. There's no starting point. There's a very clear continuation here between Plato and Hegel. The idea that there is no pinpointable reason or passion or desire. They're all based on the negative determination of the other. If that makes sense. I hope this isn't getting like too philosophical here, probably. But so we have, again, it's the fact that if you want to go back to that image we had from Inception about the spinning top. For Plato, it's not just the problem between movement and lack of movement, but it's that third element, that stain
Yeah.
on the real. That thing that you can't get rid of. That's the epor se muove that we had, right? The yet it moves.
The gum on the bottom of your shoe.
The gum, yeah, exactly. The thing that emerges where there should be nothing. That is the necessary derivative of that. So it's not just reason and passion, but it's reason and passion negating desire. It's not just passion and desire, but it's passion and desire negating reason. It's not just reason and desire, but it's reason and desire negating passion. And so there's this constant 3 becoming 1, but also 3 becoming 4. And I want, if you're going to join us next week, 3 becoming 4 is going to be the theme of our final lecture, because we've seen how 2 become 3, and we have not yet seen how 3 becomes 4. That's going to be like a tiny little teaser. How are we doing on time, by the way? We've got, I'm not quite sure. Oh,
15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. This is excellent. We're going to be able to wrap this up so well.
Making sure we have enough battery.
I want to go back to the Aeneid for a moment here. Remember, we're talking about Virgil's Aeneid at the beginning of this lecture, and how how Aeneas is led into the underworld being a place of both past and of future. And
because he visits his father, doesn't he?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he visits many people actually, because, so I'm really glad that you mentioned this. Thank you. What's so interesting and so unique about the going into the underworld is that not only does he meet those people who have already died, he meets those people who are yet to die. He meets those Roman heroes who have not yet lived and have not yet been killed. So it is like looking into the future, but a future that becomes sort of retroactive.
Right.
And there's a very specific reason why this happens. And it has to do with the whole point of the creation of Virgil's Aeneid in the first place. Because, of course, who commissioned this?
Oh, it's Augustus?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
This is supposed to be Augustus.
Propaganda. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, yes. Okay, let's call it propaganda, but let's call it perhaps the most beautiful propaganda ever devised. One of the things that I don't know if we've mentioned in this lecture, but it's really important to understand about propaganda is that propaganda does not have to be untruthful. We always think of propaganda, right?
Yeah.
We think of propaganda as being lies, but actually propaganda can also be the truth. It's just that it's a truth that is trying to facilitate a certain way of viewing the truth.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so back to it. Yes, I love it when you're just like in sync. That really makes me very happy. So yeah, Augustus. Also, if Jenny lectured and had to ask me trivia questions, I would blank, because I am like a rehearsed person and you're a genuine person. Okay, so of course the Aeneid is commissioned, as it were, to create a sense of continuity of the Augustinian Empire within the overall mythic structure set by Homer,
right?
And the founding of sort of the empire and all the way into the Augustinian Empire. And there's actually, in the structure of the Aeneid itself, there's a constant mirroring of the past, the present, and the future. And specifically, if you look at, we can see 2 different endings. One ending, which is, I guess, book 12, I think it's book 12. Yeah, book 12, we have the impassioned, brutal murder, where Aeneas murders Turnus. And specifically, the murder that Aeneas commits is a murder of revenge. He is avenging someone. And the person he is avenging is his young comrade in arms, whose name is familiar to students who have watched these classes. It is the namesake of our studio, Pallas. Aeneas is avenging Pallas. Pallas is his young comrade in arms. And the final book, the final scene, as it were, of the Aeneid is the avenging of Pallas. And it is the moment in which passion oversteps its mark, because it's a brutal killing. It's not just an act of murder, but it is a repeated death, as it were. It's sort of like in Dickens, So when one of the murderers doesn't just stab the victim once, but stabs them 10 times, right? It's that excessive impulse. So that is the official ending, the official sort of climax, as it were. But in book 8, at the end of book 8, we see, I'm not sure if it's the end, but in book 8, we see Aeneas's shield. And inscribed on the shield of Aeneas is the future history, if you will, the future history of the Augustinian Empire, inscribed onto the shield itself. In other words, we have a dual trajectory. We have the trajectory of the story that goes in a certain direction, and then we have the meta narrative in the story that is pointing towards the empire that is yet to be, as it were. It's in the future becomes inscribed into the mythic narrative, as if the mythic narrative belonged to the world that had not yet come. And so, in a sense, what's happening in the Aeneid is that we're committing a form of that, what I was talking about, like that archaeology where the past becomes the future, the future becomes the past. And so we have that doubling. But again, it's really important to note that doubling is itself, right, the end of the story versus the meta story, the end that the readers know true, the end that readers expect, which is the Augustinian Empire. That doubling is the same doubling that is in the bow and arrow movement. Because again, we can understand now how Apollo, and of course Apollo features strongly in the narrative, how Apollo is not just a double patron. In other words, he's not just the god of the arts and the god of the bow, but that specifically the arts is the bow. That the mythic structure of the Aeneid is both the foretelling of, wow, that was really noisy, both the foretelling of a certain future of the Augustinian Empire, as well as the mythic origins of the Roman Empire. And what's really important to understand here, I hope this isn't too confusing, is that it's not in sync. It is not in harmony. It's specifically contradictory, specifically imploding. What I mean by that is that in the Aeneid, we have a story that ends in a certain failure. If it were a propaganda to simply say, and then the Augustinian Empire happened, it wouldn't work as a piece of art. The implication of the Augustinian Empire is written into the story, but is not the end goal of the story. And vice versa, the Augustinian Empire doesn't yet exist in that sense. You see what I mean? We're not there yet. The story is constantly implying that we will be there. And there's something a little bit disturbing here, which is almost similar to like the Nazi idea of the 1,000-year empire, das 1000-jährige Reich. Because remember, the 1,000-year empire is not just from year 1 to year 1,000.
It's not into the future.
Yeah, it's both. It's stretching 1,000 years into the future and 1,000 years into the past. In other words, if we want to use again the libidinal economy, and we could say, Donna's rolling her eyes, which is lovely. I very much like when you're rolling your eyes. The temporal economy, to be very expensive here, is specifically distorted with the Aeneid, right? There's no clear timeline with the Aeneid because the point of the false timeline is to suggest a real timeline, and the point of the real timeline of the Augustinian Empire is to suggest a false timeline within the narrative.
Well, and that's why it works so well that he goes into the underworld. Is that what you're saying? It's because the underworld is the place of distortion. And so the underworld is the only place at which this kind of story can be told, not because that's where he finds these necessary characters, but that's where he's distorting place and time and interaction to be able to sort of act out this.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned the underworld, because that's a link that we have to have here, because the underworld is the place where that structure of the Aeneid is most particular, not particular, most specific. But Virgil is not saying that the Augustinian Empire is the same thing as the underworld. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And if anything, this is where we're going to link it back to Plato. No, you can keep it on you if you want. I mean, it doesn't really matter. The reaction shot. thank you for keeping this on your mind. Plato, remember, has society and the individual, and that they're structured in the same manner. In other words, there is no such thing as society without the individual. There's no such thing as the individual without society. And vice versa, that bipartite structure is mirrored within the subject itself, because there is no subject without the three competing elements, in the same way that there is no city without the three competing subjects who are in turn predicated upon the three competing elements. And for Plato, harmony is when all of those are in sync. In the structure of the Aeneid, within Virgil, this is the overarching point that can be made about the arts and about reality, which is that the Augustinian Empire is only in harmony when its constituent elements within the Aeneid are made to fit into the mythic narrative of the Roman Empire. And vice versa, the Aeneid only works as a piece of art if its constituent elements fit within the continuation of the expected future. And there's a specific imploding of myth and reality, in which reality becomes myth and myth becomes reality. Now, this is not unique to the Aeneid. This is true for all political systems and all societies. It's not just that we tell ourselves stories about what it means to be American or what it means to be British or Indian. It's that those stories itself are shaped by a contingent reality, and that the necessary determination of the story is shaped in that. Okay, very confusing, but I'm actually leading up to a point here, I hope.
Yeah.
What is Plato's final conclusion here about harmony, right? Remember, he was saying that morality is when everything is in sync. And the way that I like to read Plato is, again, not trying to sound pretentious here, I've become self-aware about pretension, is that Plato's point, ultimately, is that there is no specific point of morality. Harmony is specifically predicated on the impossibility of determining harmony. In other words, harmony is not the moment in which everything is fixed into place. Harmony is the moment at which everything is out of sync, yet in sync. It's a little bit like when you're watching one of those, this may be a generational reference if this makes sense, you're watching one of those screensavers, like DVD screensavers used to have, like, everything is like bumping. Like dum, dum, dum,
and you'd wait for it to hit the corner.
And it never hits the corners. And the point of that screensaver is that it never hits the corners. In other words, the determining principle of that screensaver is that it never hits the corner. If it hit the corner, it wouldn't be a screensaver. And it's very mesmerizing. I don't know if you've ever watched this, but it is almost impossible to look away, even though you know it's not going to hit any of the corners. I really hope this makes sense to people. It's very generational. And of course, you know it's not going to hit any of the corners, and that's why you keep watching. It's that movement that creates a sort of stillness. Again, it renders us into the spinning top, right?
Yes.
We are transfixed in that moment. And so for Plato, that is ultimately the observation, which is that the moment of harmony is not a moment, but it's actually a never-ending process.
Well, it's not a moment of stillness, but it's a moment of balance.
Yeah. Yes, but it's the balance of never being resolved.
Right.
And of course, this is why ultimately, despite its, and perhaps because of its oppressive elements, the Republic has the same structure as a democracy. Because remember, we argued last week that the structuring principle of democracy is the fact that there is no structuring principle. In other words, the whole point of democracy is that it is never complete, in the same way that the subject is never complete. And who made that argument before anybody else? It was, of course, Plato. The argument that we made last week, we can see exactly mirrored within Plato. The determining principle of harmony is the absence of harmony's completeness. And what is the name for the absence of harmony's completeness? It is morality. This is where morality enters the world. And to end on a Hegelian note, One of Hegel's famous aphorisms is that the subject is the object, the spirit is the bone. And we're going to explore that more next week. But this is not unlike what Plato's saying. Society is structured like the individual. The individual is structured like society. We could even throw Lacan in there, and we could say that truth is structured like a fiction. This is one of his famous ones, right? And of course, fiction, if you look at the Aeneid, is structured like a truth. And so here we have a moment of X, a moment of imploding and exploding. But, my dear friends, we are also in the second part of what is our 3-part lectures. So the resolution of this motion is what we shall find next week. And the resolution of the entire lecture series will come next week as well. So to summarize very quickly what this class was about.
Yeah.
Remember, we started with the idea that the historian is a prophet who looks towards the past. But then I said, what about the other way around? What if we have a theorist who is an archaeologist who looks towards the future, introducing the implosion explosion?
Right.
The idea of motion and tension in the bow and arrow being not one movement, but 2 movements.
Right.
We had the spinning top in Inception, the idea that something can have contradictory natures, that the contradictory nature actually emphasizes its effect, it's real, rather than D, so there's an excessive element. We talked about how Plato says that society is like this, right? Society and the individual are in harmony, but their very point of being in harmony is that they are seemingly extraneous to each other. Right. That is mirrored on the level of individual subjectivity through the 3 constituent elements that are constantly both in harmony and not in harmony, like the spinning top, and that the structure of the Aeneid mirrors this in terms of the reality of the empire to come versus the mythos of what has already been.
Well, and especially with the Aeneid mirroring the Iliad and Odyssey.
Yes. Yeah. And finally, that we have here the 3 becoming 4. And the 3 becoming 4, of course, is an indication of how we have that in a society. The structural principle is its own impossibility. That, my friends, also mirrors the second lecture in our lecture series. If you go back to the second lecture where we focus on Orpheus and Freud's Father, Why Are You Burning? You will see the mirror image to this particular lecture.
Yes.
So, thank you very much. We are going to wrap up here. We very, very, very much hope that you will join us next week for our final lecture, which is week 12, in which we will have the conclusion of this lecture series, followed by week 13, in which we will have a master narrative of how all 12 lectures can be read. In other words, we're going to read the lectures. We're going to see how they all fit together. Because we, my friends, have built up a very elaborate puzzle here. And it has been my true pleasure to get to deliver these lectures to you. I also want to say thank you to Jenline for being just incredibly patient and incredibly supportive as we put together these lectures. But I'm going to keep the speech for next week when we finish. So from me, Julian, to you, and Jenline, to you. Thank you for joining us for yet another lecture in the X lecture series. And we shall see you all next week.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And now, and YouTube viewers, thank you very much for watching.
No secret message this week.
Oh, there should be a secret message, I think, maybe. Yeah, we'll see. The secret message is actually